this series, The Spiritual Lives of Scientists, brought to you by the Science and Spirituality Synergy Circle of the Evolutionary Leaders. These discussions feature global thought leaders dialoguing with Dr. Paul J. Mills, neuroscientist and author of the 2022 Light on Light book, Science, Being, and Becoming, The Spiritual Lives of Scientists, forward by Deepak Chopra, special commentary by Ken Wilber. I'm Dr. Kurt Johnson of the Synergy Circles of the Evolutionary Leaders. Each video will engage Dr. Mills in a discussion with a global thought leader introduced immediately after this introduction of Dr. Mills. Dr. Paul J. Mills, Ph.D., is Professor of Public Health and Family Medicine, Director of the Center of Excellence for Research and Training in Integrative Health, and former Chief of Behavioral Medicine at the University of California, San Diego. He has over 400 scientific publications in the fields of pharmacology, oncology, cardiology, behavioral medicine, and integrative health. And he published some of the earliest scientific research on meditation. His work has been featured in Time Magazine, the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, the Huffington Post, Gaia TV, WebMD, and many others. And he has presented his work at hundreds of conferences around the world, including at the United Nations. The book synopsis of Science, Being, and Becoming, The Spiritual Lives of Scientists, emphasizes that contrary to popular belief, not all scientists are materialists or fervently discount the spiritual. The book includes interviews with some of the world's most foremost scientists and physician scientists who recount their own transpersonal, metaphysical, and mystical experiences, and how these experiences transform their lives and their scientific work. Their accounts teach us that the long-standing divide between science and spirituality is actually false, and that science can fulfill an intended purpose to help us discover and understand all of life, including our spiritual nature. Their stories help us to understand the spiritual world may be the final frontier for science. So let's go over now and introduce our guest for this discussion. This episode is Michael Lennon. Michael Lennon is a senior fellow at the Center for Excellence in Public Leadership at George Washington University. He works across a broad sector of academic and polity communities, equipping leaders and organizations to adapt and transform their systems, management practices, and people, particularly using cutting-edge, science-informed methodologies. These leverage transdisciplinary research methods for collaboratively interrogating mystery and complexity, weaving insights from the diverse sciences, system science, evolution, positive psychology, and social neuroscience, with insights from other evidentiary sources, including the great wisdom traditions. Recently, Michael has been assisting prosocial.world, a large and newly emergent community of progressive scientists, informing the relationship of hard science with multiple other arenas of human engagement, including those of consciousness and spirituality. I, and Dr. Mills previously joined in presenting a Spiritual Lives of Scientists program for the 2023 Complexity Science Summit, where Michael coordinated with programs from prosocial.world, Earth Regenerators, the Deep Transformation Network, and the We All Network Collaboratory. Prosocial.world gathers scientists to take a look at the implications of modern scientific discovery as to how it affects and will affect human behavior and values toward what is called a prosocial behavior, the opposite of the often antisocial or not people or not earth-friendly behaviors that so often characterize our world's arenas of politics, economics, policy, and so on. It works toward evolving a collective prosociality, one characterized by collective capacities for well-being at all scales, including skills for mutuality, adaptation, renewal, regeneration, reciprocity, and the like. So let's go over now to Michael Lennon and Paul J. Mills. Okay, I'm here with Paul Mills and Michael Lennon, who we've just told you so much about. Their life and work is closely parallel. That of Paul, recounted in his book, Science, Being, and Becoming, The Spiritual Lives of Scientists, and particularly in his introductory video to this series, that'd be episode 1, Paul's whole life and work has been about this straddle of hard science and spirituality consciousness and how those relate to our foundational human values of love, caring, and so on. Similarly, Michael tells us in his biography, his life has been about leveraging transdisciplinary research methods for collaboratively interrogating mystery and complexity, and weaving insights from diverse sciences, that is, system science, evolution, positive psychology, and social neuroscience, with insights from other evidentiary sources such as the great wisdom traditions, the marketplace, as well as individual practitioner inquiry to facilitate collective transformational learning and adaptational journeying. So that adds a great additional framing. So let's start with me asking each of you this question. From your life and work, how would you characterize the challenge of historically the often overriding sense of a divide between science on the one hand and matters of spirit, spirituality, values, and so on the other? What has been your experience of that, and why has that experience caused you to dedicate much of your work to addressing or even closing that supposed divide? So let's start with Paul.
Sure, Kurt. Thank you. And Michael, good to see you again. Really looking forward to our conversation as I've learned more about your work at George Washington University, and your Center of Excellence, and this transdisciplinary effort that you've been behind for so long. Because for me, that's what has been needed, certainly in my domain within the scientific world, and addressing your question, Kurt. I mean, for me personally, on the challenge side, I'd say it falls into a couple of areas. One, just to find the proper expression to bring forth certain ideas that I've had about the kind of spirituality and the scientific world. But also within that challenge of reputation, also the challenge of resources, I would say. The resources side is just grant funding, the sort of things I was interested in doing, pursuing more the inner nature of the human being, the consciousness side, the transcendent side. It wasn't easy to find research dollars for that kind of work. And I really, therefore, didn't get to spend much time in it until the latter part of my career. Reputation, I think, is kind of obvious because this domain's historically been kind of shunned, at least in the scientific fields I've been in. And so it was always a little bit of a worry beginning to venture into that. And I didn't really do it until I was more in the latter part of my career, tenure and the whole thing. And that's really been the challenge. And as far as what have I tried to do to help ameliorate that, just slow inroads. Some of the early things I did, which was kind of simple, was just doing research on meditation. More to understand the physiology of meditation. That was kind of low-hanging fruit and more acceptable. Then a little bit later, I moved into energy medicine research, which is pretty far out there, but managed to get some of that done. And then I mentioned the consciousness piece, which just really the last couple of years, we were able to bring some of that in, and I can get to that a little bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Paul. And so then the same question about this supposed divide to Michael.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, one of the things that I should frame that wasn't in that wonderful introduction, thank you, was that my undergrad was actually as an economist at Georgetown University, and that my first job, if you will, after undergrad, was at the World Bank. You could say, world leader in development economics, and certainly a thought leader when it came to research in the field. And one of the things that differentiates economists from many other social scientists up until recently was that not that many social scientists were allowed in the front office of corporations, or even at the bank for that matter. There might be psychologists, there might be environmentalists and such, and they were all treated as science disciplines that could inform decision making, but the key decision was to be done by an objective CEO that was detached, if you will, from the limits, if you will, of different disciplines. And basically, what led me on this journey of spanning disciplines was not it was a humiliating series of experiences rather than what some would say is another revelation. Discipline after discipline outside of economics started winning Nobel Prizes and pointing to flaws in the assumptions that made the discipline of economics coherent and work. What made a strength as a in being able to articulate to the front office quantitatively this, that, or the other recommendations was in fact filled with assumptions that did not hold up when you discarded this famous phrase in economics, ceteris paribus, which basically you take your model, and what doesn't fit in your model you just say externalities. They don't fit. And what that externalities phrase does is it kind of then enables you to ignore all kinds of things, whether these things are pollution, and say, well, it's an externality, or it can be accounted in the following ways, or other forms of difficult to quantify experience, including subjective human experience. And I reached a personal crisis I was describing earlier when, at one point, a different economist who had just gotten kicked out of office had been voted out of office in the UK. He's now famous as Sir Richard Layard for being a happiness economist. But basically, he showed a chart that showed a GDP tripling over the 60 years. And then in that same period, well-being not moving at all. And so it was kind of like, whatever it is that we're doing and we're advising countries and we're advising companies to do is definitely generating more output. It's definitely something is happening, busyness is happening, but we're not really fundamentally attending to what matters most. And so this was really a kind of disorienting crisis in many ways, and set me on a path similar to what Sir Layard had followed, which was when he got kicked out of office, he went back to academia and looked at what is in fact science uncovering that moves the needle of well-being, that moves the needle of happiness, but is locked up in academic papers that nobody else is reading. Not that, and he started a movement, you could say, to make this knowledge socially more contagious. And I said, I'm going to join that movement. Here I go. And so that kind of led me on this a journey of unlearning, of adapting all kinds of things that at the time seemed, seriously, are you crazy? Are you nuts? In fact, the first time I mentioned that I went on a pilgrimage, I just got back from one, but 15 years ago, which is when I did my first one. I found myself talking to an ally saying, I'm not sure if I'm losing my mind or finding my soul. And she just laughed and she said, Michael, you must lose your mind to find your soul. And little did I understand what she even meant at the time, but today I do. And this whole idea of having a different posture to the limits of one's own knowledge, to be in good relation to mystery. Science does a great job of positing what might in fact be the hypothesis that fills in the mystery, but sometimes it's insufficiently humble about its hypothesis, and there's much more to be uncovered. And so that's what I found Paul's work and your work to be so very powerful about, was kind of bringing a discipline and rigor to mystery that scientists and science needed to kind of upgrade from, and to allow new forms of evidence, new ways of knowing, new ways of telling stories, and really incorporating, not just as we as economists would do, well, if it's monetized data, we'll take it into account. If it's not, we're going to weigh it very differently. And it perpetuated our own blind spots. And that's exactly what's been happening in the in field after field after field, where we've said, to be an expert, you have to draw these boxes, and anything outside those boxes, don't go there. So that's a long answer, but
that's great. And before we go ahead, I want to give Paul a chance also to respond just to that, because in some of our previous conversations, he's talked about where science has taken authority, and it's very questionable where it actually authentically had authority in those areas. So to that whole commentary, back to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, I really appreciate what you were speaking about, and it resonated with some changes in my fields, actually. Earlier on in an area called psychoneuroimmunology and behavioral medicine, and then integrative medicine. So behavioral medicine, for example, historically looked only at things like depression, anxiety, type A behavior. And back to your points about well-being and happiness, then what happened? Well, the field of positive psychology got started, and people started doing research on altruism and love and compassion and gratitude. And that honestly, in many ways, opened the field to be more receptive to doing things such as research on meditation and anything else, yoga and self-development, acupuncture, and so forth. So that kind of snuck in, wasn't anticipated, but then it started making it more feasible. And then funding started coming in to do those areas, and then it has spread out from there. So I appreciate that kind of transformation. And you're right, Kurt. I remember we've spoken about that science has been an area that, well, it just discounted a certain area as economics did for you. And it was just kind of bizarre, because I growing up, going into science because of my own inner life, let's say a rich inner life, but I couldn't include that as far as an objective way in my scientific research, as far as domains of research and going to conferences about it. It was excluded. And back to, the interdisciplinary nature, that's going to get us there. Have traditional science begin to open up to all these more mystery, the wisdom traditions and so forth, which it is happening, but more in isolated areas. And just imagine if all the resources of Western science, the just billions of dollars in funding and the brain power at so many institutions started getting directed towards that. Well, we'd have some meaningful discovery, that would foster well-being.
Yeah, Michael, any further comment from you before we move ahead? Because we're actually going in that direction with our discussion.
Yes. One of the individuals who spanked, if you will, the economics profession was a psychologist. Some would say, I'll use a different example first, but the first woman to win the Economic Nobel Prize, she was a political scientist, and basically her great contribution was to not make the assumptions that everybody had previously about either you had marketplaces or you had institutions explaining everything. There were these other things, these collective bodies called commons, and she built a body of evidence and theories and kind of just revolutionized the field to show non-monetary kind of things. Well, similarly, the psychologists who disrupted the field looked at how we think and the biases of the mind that are in place, and one pointing to positive psychology was, often a natural bias in human is harm reduction. If we simply shrink what's wrong, if we look at, if to use religious language, if we look at the sins and eliminate the sins, then we have created virtue, which is not the case any more than removing the bitterness from an ingredient, from a dish, doesn't make it sweet. It's a different ingredient to put in altogether. And so there's been this whole kind of understanding the assumptions inherent in what we knew, and realizing that, there are entire new ways of practicing and inhabiting the things that we took for granted that have opened up, whether they were how to reduce, in the case of economics, how to reduce waste, and what does it mean to grow well-being, well, rather than just grow, adding money in the economy, growing happiness, growing connection, protecting the environment, and all these factors which are so central to spirituality, but were trivialized, or not trivialized, but underweighted by the profession at the time.
All right. Well, so we'll move ahead now. We have this context of both of you having dedicated so much of your life to closing this historical divide. Paul, as he recounts in his book, and particularly Michael recently in work that he's been doing with prosocial.world. And check out that website, prosocial.world, which is a large community of scientists who are also exploring this straddle. So the question then to both of you is now, what have been specific strategies and activities that you've offered and found successful to bringing more closely and compatibly together what has historically seemed to be such a polarized landscape? So we'll start with Paul.
As I ponder that question, my mind goes to the field of integrative medicine, these days often called integrative health. And that's been another kind of side door that's occurred in different areas of medicine and medical research to bring in some of these wisdom traditions. Here in the US, we started the complementary alternative medicine movement that was, say, in the late 70s, and then it evolved over time to what we have now. And initially, yes, that was bringing in things such as meditation into clinical practice, and many academic centers now have centers for integrative medicine. And some of the work we started doing is doing a deeper dive into some of these traditions, such as Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine, Native American medicine, and focusing on let's say, the rich understanding of the nature of the human being in those traditions, beyond just the body, the idea of the energy centers of the body, of consciousness itself as a fundamental human identity. And we were able to use those traditions to start bringing in those ideas and to basically modify how well-being is understood in some of these centers that do this research and also clinical practice, to begin to understand more the whole person, the whole nature of the human being, including the consciousness side of things, and how to cultivate that beyond and including known areas such as, again, meditation and yoga and so forth. But just to begin to bring that into the conversation. And that's begun to expand appreciation. I think it also has cultivated just more compassion and appreciation within these centers as I've seen them operate over the years, just in terms of the patient-physician relationship. Person's no longer just a symptom standing in front of the healthcare worker, but okay, this is actually a human being. There's a lot more going on here than just the body, and it's very rich. So that's one of the areas. And again, I mentioned earlier, just moving into research in these domains. That's been, our little efforts to move this needle.
Yeah, absolutely. So that same question to Michael, and particularly in the context with what you've been doing with Pro-Social World and what you've been asked to do there, which is a large community that's really been asking about how to approach this historical enigma about the straddle. So Michael, yeah, over to you on that.
There's so much I could say, so I'll just try and share some highlights. First of all, one of the reasons I love pro-social, it is in fact an interdisciplinary science that pulls from 3 different branches of science to create a new interdisciplinary science of cooperation, or an approach to human cooperation. The 3 lenses that it pulls from are what I describe, this is my own language, but 3 lenses: one that looks within, one that looks within humans, between humans, and then beyond humans. And so the within is from psychology, and although there's it pulls more generally from the leading edges, ACT and commitment therapy, which is, some would say, a kind of science verified form of a contemplative practice, you could say, both becoming connected to what is happening and then choosing how to respond. A very natural practice for people from Buddhism and a variety of other contemplative practices, but which has been scrutinized by scientists and seen what are parts that turn out to be reliably consistent and predictive. Now, I'm doing a little bit more of a deep dive than I intended to, but the branch, one of the things I love about the lens within has been this tool, a matrix for really reflecting both individually or collectively. And I think it's the extending this tool into the collective that has been a brilliant innovation. And that is not the ACT matrix, we call it the matrix, but I'm trying to remember its exact. And basically, it's very simple. It's this idea of what is the purpose, and then what are the thoughts and actions that are either moving towards purpose or away from purpose, and whether one uses this as a reflective device for oneself to simply see, okay, am I moving in the direction of my goals? To use that as a group facilitation device, particularly allowing for internal states to be surfaced, is one of the brilliant things that we culturally, particularly in the West, have all kinds of norms prohibiting us from describing what the internal states might be. Instead, we talk about behavior to one degree or another, but we don't interpret. And by creating a space and a mechanism that allows us to say these thoughts happened, these behaviors came out, or the other way around, it allows for a literacy to emerge in group dynamics that otherwise has been constrained by traditional precedent. Oh, we don't talk about that, whether it's race, gender, profit, anything. It's a magnificent tool. And so as any science, once you have the mechanism, it can be applied in a gigantic variety of contexts. And so I have found that time and time again, it's a great mechanism for kind of opening up the psychological space of how will we attend And how will we assess whether or not we are aligning or diverging as a group? And the very act of creating the permission to speak about it, it's kind of like naming with other social taboos. It might be, oh, are we going to talk about discrimination? Only by first bringing it up in a safe manner does it then become safe subsequently for folks to say, might this be what we were talking about? And it is a great enricher of conversations that that otherwise get constrained, as I say, by precedent. So now the other two disciplines were economics, the work of Eleanor Ostrom, and specifically, I mentioned already that she basically pointed out that there was a different way for groups to negotiate sustainably and reliably shared areas of interest. Now, this started with things like ecological commons like fisheries and forests, but the principles have been extended over and over and over. And so it becomes a way for groups to better practice in a principle-based manner, better co-regulation. There are lots of competing theories out there about how to better cooperate with others, but one of the things that science tends to do is it scrutinizes all of them and says, which one more reliably hits the mark? And that's the thing that she kind of uncovered, that it's like there may be other principles and rules that people could be using, but when these fundamental 8 are not used, it's fundamentally diagnostic of some interhuman dynamics that need attention. And finally, the third, the lens of beyond, is the lens of evolution, which begins to look at a large-scale change, and particularly the work that Dave Sloan Wilson is most to be celebrated for, at least in my estimation, is really the courage to extend these principles that are taken for granted in nature and are now understood to apply to human dynamics as much as anywhere else. That we had created cultural labels that kept human dynamics in separate spaces, and that these have been demystified in ways that can now be described scientifically and used for predictions that otherwise were seemed complex and inscrutable. So last thing I'll make as a remark is that one of the experiments that the community of prosocial is that I'm involved in is an inter-community learning project. And basically, we've taken a diverse set of communities, the prosocial community being one, the community of earth regenerators who are looking to transform the field of environmentalism by not just doing harm reduction, but what does it mean to restore and regenerate the ecosystems at play? We've got to up our game from just how much can we extract to how do we enter into a mutualistic relationship. So the Earth Regenerators community, and thirdly, the Deep Transformation Network, which is a group that I particularly admire because of the way in which they have been, I would say, reverse engineering. You could say secular prophets, having a vision of how would the breakdowns of today lead to the breakthroughs of tomorrow, and then telling stories that are what are the deep transformational practices and experiences that need to be happening so that the world benefits from the crises and the challenges of today, and they become the breakthroughs of tomorrow. So these three communities have been endeavoring to collaborate and see what kind of synergies they might have in common. And they've just recently, using the structure of a different community, the complexity science community, begun to do action learning sprints and different kind of prototyping activities that can push the learning edges of each of the fields. And I'm excited to, well, I shouldn't, with some of the work around building the noosphere, in other words, this idea of planetary consciousness, it's something that we might be trying to weave these four communities, not just the human communities, but the technologies and the technologists, to really think, okay, how might collective consciousness at a planetary level unfold, and how might we prototype those things? So very ambitious, and surely we will fail more often before we get there, but beautiful, beautiful challenges to which to give ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to toss that back to Paul, but just with a quick caveat that so people will know that the pro-social community really grew out of the scientists who were looking at the implications of the great transition in 2015 and our understanding of natural selection, that it wasn't always about competition in a system, but as a system complexified, the definition of fitness actually changed from competition to cooperation. And if at the higher levels of complex system, it was all about cooperation, then what were the implications of that? And that's where Lynn Ostrom's work came in. So it's an incredibly diverse community, and that's really why Michael was asked to start adjudicating this, because people didn't feel comfortable talking about certain aspects, or did. In fact, one of the most popular threads on the pro-social commons has been, is or isn't, and why isn't the strict scientific worldview enough for you? Or why isn't it enough for you? And you could really see the diversity of where people felt comfortable and also where they didn't. So throwing that to Paul, because see, Paul also, you know, when you were in some of your conversations with, let's say, like Dr. Shamini Jain, who ends up being a pioneer now in her own right, but started out as your graduate student, you're really the one that gave her permission to start a whole new wave of the amount of integration of some of these more holistic operations in the things you were doing. So you've really seen the same transition as well. So if you want to comment to what Michael just said, please do.
Sure, a couple of things. One, I'm in awe, Michael, of what you just described. I have some familiarity, of course, of the pro-social, but I didn't have a sense of how it can be all these techniques you've learned, that you can integrate all these diverse domains. And to really, I mean, I felt enthusiastic and some hope we could really begin to solve some of these extremely pressing problems that we're all facing. And I admire these very broad systems approaches. I historically am more of a linear kind of thinker, so I don't excel in those domains, but I have been fortunate to have some graduate students and fellows come through the lab. Yes, where I did, let's say, provide an environment where they could begin to spread their wings in some of these areas historically not studied in science, at least my disciplines. And they've done good work since then. Yeah, you mentioned Chamonix, Dr. Joseph Tafur is another one. There have been a handful. So I've really loved and appreciated seeing them blossom and the kind of changes they're making for the better. As far as integration and bringing different groups together for the purposes of discovery and creating the environment where those conversations can take place. Perhaps they're using, however unconsciously, Michael, some of the methods you described to us so far, where these things can begin to emerge, we get an understanding of them, finding a situation where, okay, we're comfortable now, we can speak about that. And let's take that new added dimension of the knowledge and then use it in this discipline. And then how can we add it here and begin to really have a crosstalk that's solves things that need to be solved. And we no longer exclude just based on just a kind of mindless prejudice. So we shouldn't talk about that.
Yeah, no, so absolutely. So as we move toward closing here, this is just really perfect as we want to take a look at the future. So last question that we want you both to lean in on is that knowing that both of you have had a degree of success in this process, and also historically now that science and spirit/consciousness both embrace deep understandings of the profound interconnection of all things, how would you describe a possible future world in which these aspects of our nature and in our global cultures could work together and complement each other in far more profound and skillful ways than they have in the past. So start with Paul.
Well, I'll focus back on the scientist. Remember Rupert Sheldrake? He published a book some years ago, Set Science Free, and I've been advocating, set scientists free more as far as their own inner spiritual life or spiritual development. Michael, you used the term secular prophets. I interpreted that one way. I don't know if you meant it that way as far as prophets like, Alleluia, or prophets in terms of finances, but you meant the Alleluia, yes? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if more scientists could become secular prophets too, and utilize their brilliance in their respective disciplines to really begin to push the envelope and open the doors to things that have been ignored, and then begin to understand what the detriments have been for us socially and scientifically from ignoring very key domains of scientific endeavor, and then integrate that and those observations and discoveries in the broader collective, the sort of way you're doing, Michael. That's what I'd like to see, and that's what I'm trying to do in my own way by encouraging scientists who have any inclination to move in these directions of self-exploration and to transform their own scientific work. And that's been happening slowly but surely, and it's very encouraging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting that the last video that we just did actually yesterday, which will parallel this one, was with Paul and with Rion Eisler. And they were talking about this in the context of how we move from an entire global consciousness of dominance and dominance cultures to the partnership consciousness and partnership cultures that we would need even to survive, let alone thrive. And if we can't move in that direction, up against the embedding of everything that's in our primate past and everything else, then, really seeing this challenge. So, Michael, take a turn on that question. What do you see as the changes and promises of the future?
The thing that I find most exciting and both challenging is when some of these problems take place across disciplines, the in-betweening. So and there's a lot of attention in applying these techniques personally, and an enormous amount of benefit arising from taking on these practices personally. There is a whole other level of practice when one starts working between or in face of beyond what one's comfort zone is. And so this is exactly why, when I was describing earlier the matrix for how to walk towards or away from a goal, a metaphor that when groups come together, different disciplines come together to work on something, is they all have expertise in something, and they also all have blind spots, some of which might be evident to other disciplines. Others may be blind spots in common. And so there's a real threat to inquiry that one must take on. Am I willing to be the one who acknowledges not being the expert, not being the one who knows, the one who undermines, whether it's my profession or my own standing. And biologically, we're wired to protect our standing instead of advancing the edges of science. And this is why we keep on having people solve problems in the same way over and over and over again, because you can get investment in certain kind of problem-solving approaches and not in others, which was part of what we opened this conversation with. And so and why funding often occurs within disciplines and not in interdisciplinary work. One of the things that the prosocial tool can be very useful in is I'm a economist, so I tend to use graphs. Think of this vertical as representing complexity, and there's a line across reflecting the limits of one's own brain or of the group. And as one approaches that line, the norm, when one comes up against the limits of one, is to return back to what is familiar, or what is often called silo thinking. He who's good with a hammer solves every problem as a nail. And to go beyond one's sense of the familiar, to go beyond is where the possibility of strategic clarity, of better problem solving, of transformative innovation all arises. But it happens under vulnerable conditions, and it requires loving presence, that we practice psychological safety with each other. And this is why there's wisdom from spiritual practices about really being both with ourselves and each other in the face of not knowing, and really carrying forward. And so as we become more skillful at really being with each other and being with the mystery together, we really open up whole new ways of knowing, whole new ways of understanding that presently our state of practice does not allow. And I look forward to being a catalyst in the widening of the heart that allows for the brain to follow, the logic to follow.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I'm going to go back to Paul on that in the context of giving you each a chance then to give kind of a summary to, this has been a wonderful conversation. So Paul, I know you're going to want to key in on that one because so much of that is what I hear from you. So
yeah, again, it's kind of a wow. I'm in awe. I really appreciate everything you just described, Michael, and the work you're doing and the position and the understanding that you have going forward. It's given me a more sense of like hope and promise around this work that I've been endeavoring to support in one way or another, because there are innate limitations. You just described so many of them that exist within a discipline. But the kind of work you're teaching others to do and that you're doing yourself, they're tools, as you're saying, to begin to open the cracks and permit some of this conversation. I'm just enthused. Where's it going to end? I mean, imagine we have Western scientific endeavor, all the gates are open, in a proper way. I know there's reasons historically why the whole spiritual side of things has been kind of closed off. Fair enough. But it's really time, and not only time, but we have a great need for just what you were saying, Michael. Open hearts, exploration of the inner. What's that going to bring to us as far as really changing and expanding the well-being of every human being on the planet and the planet herself. So I'm ready.
I'd like to thank you, because although you're thanking me, it is often the one who speaks first, who breaks the ice, that allows others then to follow suit. And by you daring to speak about the spiritual lives of scientists, I can't tell you what kind of traction, you probably know what kind of traction that phrase has gotten, and how it allows people to say, oh my God, there's a phrase, there's a community, there's a language. So you're being far too kind. You deserve credit for being the pioneer to stand up and turn on the candle. And that allows for so many of us then to kind of say, yeah. So thank you, but the mirror back at you.
yeah, and actually when Paul's book first came across our desk, that was exactly our feeling. And then we spent a good part of a year building it out to even more voices. So when it recently won the Gold Nautilus Award, we were like, wow, okay, all of that was worth it. And Paul, you really had a vision there, and how we brought in Deepak's commentary and Ken Wilber's commentary and all of that. So, all right. So a huge thank you in this series, The Spiritual Lives of Scientists, to Paul J. Mills and Michael Lennon. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Paul J. Mills, and thanks to our viewers. Each of the subsequent videos in this important video series will feature discussions with Dr. Mills in the context of his groundbreaking book, Science, Being, and Becoming: The Spiritual Lives of Scientists. And you can update yourself regularly on the series at the websites posted just hereafter, which include lightonlight.us, and the Light on Light Press and Light on Light Magazine Facebook pages, and the Sacred Stories channel at YouTube. That's YouTube at the Sacred Stories channel. Thank you for joining us, and please tell your colleagues about this important video series. This is Dr. Kurt Johnson of Light on Light Media and of the Synergy Circles of the Evolutionary Leaders, a project of the Source of Synergy Foundation. And please also see our emerging work on this important intersection of science and spirit at evolutionaryleaders.net and holomovement.org. That's HOLO movement.org.